YouTube as well, before I forget. Okay, so we are live here in this Zoom meeting and also on YouTube. And today is my pleasure to have Fabiana Zollo. Fabiana is assistant professor of computer science and board member of the New Institute Center for Environmental Humanities at Foscari, University of Venice. So her research mainly focuses on information spread in social dynamics online. She's also part of since 2019, of the European Food and Safety Authority, EFSA. Since 2020, she joined the task force of data science at AGCOM, like the Italian Communication Authority, to study misinformation around COVID and all these things. So it's a great pleasure. Thank you, Fabiana, for accepting our invitation and to be here. I know we had like many drawbacks. We have to reschedule sometimes, but I really appreciate you make the time to join us here today. Thank you again. So just one more question. It's regarding the question. So do you prefer people to hold the questions to the end, or they can interrupt during your presentation? What do you prefer?
I mean, I do not have a strong preference. I will leave a room for discussion in the end. So, but if anything is not clear during the presentation, so people are free to ask and interrupt. Otherwise, we can have a more in-depth discussion, and I can go in depth on something if you are curious or you need more information.
Okay, great. So if you have any question, you can put on the chat, or if you want, you can unmute yourself and make your question. I'm also monitoring the chat on YouTube. So if you are on YouTube and you have any question, you can just put on this chat and I'll bring it here. Okay, so without any further ado, thank you, Fabiana. The floor is yours. I think you have all the powers to share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sharing the presentation, and you should see the presentation, right? Okay. Okay, before starting, so in this presentation, I will give you a kind of quick overview of some of the previous works, main results that we had in previous works, just to explain also why we are focusing now on the topics that are more related to our current projects. And in particular, I will talk about a more recent study that we had on hate speech and the relationship with misinformation, and other active and current project. I'm starting with this sort of background and previous work, because this is really, I guess, it's kind of helpful in understanding the reasons behind some of the current studies. I mean, I'm a computer scientist. I don't know, I think that it can be that we have people from other departments and disciplines here today. So just to explain very quickly, I'm a computer scientist, a data scientist. I work mainly with data. And so the analysis that we do on the topics of misinformation, and also in general on how information spreads online and the social dynamics around public debates, we usually focus on these topics with a quantitative approach, using methods and techniques from network science and data science. And also, so the idea is, in this way, we kind of have the opportunity to have a broader picture and of what's happening and how these dynamics take place. What we have observed in the latest years is that whenever we are in this information space online, that have as some characteristics that are really, I would say, crucial also to understand certain dynamics and how we study certain dynamics. The first is the fact that, of course, information can spread very easily, very quickly. This is thanks to the structure itself of the web and of the internet, and on the other side, because of the fact that this space is really hyper connected, and so we can communicate with one another very easily and very rapidly all over the world. This also facilitated and especially with social media, the fact that everyone can not only access information, but also produce their own information. And so what we have observed over the years is that is the emergence also of new information sources that in some cases were born as alternative to mainstream information sources. So in the digital information space, we have a heterogeneous set of information and news sources, and the user plays an active role, not only in content consumption, but also in content production. The fact is that in the end, what we are as users on the other side of the screen is that we are still human beings. And so we need to process all this information that is available to us, and all the news, all the data that we have to deal with. And what we have seen is that in the end, some of our cognitive mechanisms that we put in place whenever we deal with information can also play a role whenever we are interacting with information on online social media. And indeed, what we have observed in general is a very strong polarization of the online debate. This is especially true when we are in the presence of very controversial issues. So, for example, vaccination, climate change, now, of course, with the COVID and the pandemic, political debates. So, in all these cases, whenever we analyze the data, also on different platforms, what we observed was this very strong polarization and division and segregation of users, and often the presence of the now so famous echo chambers. So the existence of groups of like-minded individuals that share a common worldview, a common narrative around a specific topic. What's interesting about echo chambers is that the segregation of echo chambers makes it very difficult to have interactions outside of these groups. And what we have studied was on one side the emotional dynamics that take place inside and between these chambers, and also how users keep informing whenever they are part of one of these groups. And what we have observed is that not only the attention of the users is confined to this segregated group of information sources, but what we have also measured and observed is that the number of news sources, information sources the user interact with decreases with the increase of the lifetime and the activity of the user on the platform. So what it's interesting to notice is that not only the attention is confined to a very refined set of news sources, but this set decreases over time and with more activity for more active users. And we have also studied, as I said, the emotional dynamics between and inside these groups, polarized groups. And what we have found is that the interaction between users coming from opposite communities and opposite groups usually tend to degenerate towards very negative feelings and very negative sentiments. So this is something that, it means that not only you have this very strong polarized environment, but also that the discussion between users with different positions and opinions on controversial issues may also result not in a civil discussion and debate, but in a in a negative and degeneration of the interaction. And the natural question was after this, so what's up? So since this is what we can observe in general, what's happening when you try to not only interact with people from another group, but also to correct information. And so we tried to understand if debunking and fact-checking activities were effective or not. And what we have observed was that, and this is, I guess, the most, from my perspective, the most interesting result is that the debunking content was not really reaching the target of, for example, pseudoscientific users, because it didn't reach that particular echo chamber. And in our data, the main consumer of debunking data was coming from the scientific echo chamber. So this is for sure one of the, I guess, one of the most interesting results, because it's telling us that when you are in a very segregated and polarized environment, this kind of approach cannot work, because first of all, it's not able to reach the target. The other thing that we observed and measured was indeed that for the users for which the debunking was able to build an interaction, these users reinforced their original viewpoint, in the sense that they increased their activity in the pseudoscientific echo chamber. I put here drawbacks of debunking and fact-checking, because from my perspective, the idea is that this cannot be the only approach that we have to deal with misinformation, for a series of reasons. The ones that I was just mentioning about the fact that it can be not effective in a very strong polarized environment, but also the fact that if you think about that, it's not feasible to think that we can stop misinformation spreading through this kind of approach. That it's very time consuming and requires also lots of human resources. And so what we tried to understand was, what can we do instead to counteract misinformation, but I would say in a more indirect, through a more indirect approach. And so I will mention here some of the possible, not solutions, but alternative approaches that we tried to analyze. The first thing that I want to mention is that what we have seen is that looking at how users are interacting with content can help us in understanding, so not the content, but how users are interacting with content in terms, for example, of polarization, sentiment, and so on, can be used to kind of, being able to predict what would be the topics that are likely to be subject to misinformation. So we are not detecting misinformation content, but we are trying to understand what topics are more likely to become misinformation in the short period. So in this way, imagine to have a system like this, what we can do is that then you can try to adapt your communication strategy around those topics to try to smooth polarization, and so to kind of limit the spread of misinformation by an indirect action. And so the question, of course, is what we can do to smooth polarization, and what would be the best communication strategy to smooth polarization and avoid and limit misinformation. We tried to answer these questions through some projects, and the one that I'm mentioning here is a project that we did with the London School of Economics and Corriere della Sera. Corriere della Sera is the main newspapers that we have in Italy, and what we did in this study was to try to understand if the way in which you are communicating the news, so the technique that you're using to tell the story, the content type that you're using to tell the story, can affect the response of the readers to your story. We did this in collaboration with the journalists, And in this project, we chose the topic of migration because was a very hot topic in the Italian agenda when we were working on the project, and also because migration was a very polarizing issue in Italy. And we wanted something like that to understand if it was possible to increase trust towards the news source, and at the same time to reduce polarization. What we did, so the journalists published all their migration-related stories over a time of some months, and we analyzed. Then they were when doing this, they tried a variety of content types and techniques. We analyzed the results in terms of engagement, of sentiment, and there was also a manual annotation of comments to label the comments as toxic, as being a source of mistrust towards the source, the Corriere, and for getting the position on the topic of migration. And we analyzed the results. And what we observed was that whenever you were using multimedia content, and especially videos, this content was getting a very strong and very supportive engagement with high numbers of likes and shares. And there was very low level of criticism towards Corriere della Sera. But whenever the facts and numbers were pushed to the forefront, like for example for infographics, there was lots of debate, lots of discussion, and a significant pushback from anti-migration voices. In terms of techniques, the news reports that appeared to be more impartial and unemotional were the ones getting the most trust, and the human interest stories that were telling the story of the migrant or the group of migrants while they're coming to Italy, the difficulties that they had to deal with before, or why they were leaving their countries. In these stories got a very strong pushback and lots of toxic comments, anti-migration comments. In general, any article from the journalists that was very strong in terms of pushing an opinion or proposing, for example, a particular policy was getting lots of criticism. So, of course, this is a study on a particular topic in Italy. But I think that the insights are interesting in the sense that what we can see is that it's not only the content, but also the way in which you decide to present that content that can shape the debate and the public debate around that content, in this case, on the news source Facebook page. And so this is telling us that maybe there are some ways in which you can try not to completely avoid polarization, because polarization is still there, but at least to find ways of facilitating a civil public discussion around controversial issues. And in this direction, so in the direction of trying to understand how quality content can survive and engage users on social media, we also had, and we were partner here in Venice of this European project on the quality and effectiveness of science communication. And what we did in this project was to analyze how science is communicated on social media in 3 different platforms and in different European countries. And in the project, we also had 3 case studies, vaccines, artificial intelligence, and climate change. But the project started before the pandemic and ended last year. And indeed, the topic of vaccines in the end was really also a very good topic to have there to understand what was happening. In the project, we designed together with communication practitioners around Europe, quality indicators to communicate science, and we analyzed this data and used this data to develop recommendations for communicating science on social media platforms. And what we did was also to test. So we designed these recommendations and we test these recommendations. If you are interested in material on science communication, how to communicate on social media and so on the website of the project, you can find lots of material that is available for free to everyone. So I'm just telling this because there is lots of material there. And what I also wanted to say today very quickly is that there is this call for application open in Venice from the Venice International University, and Exeter is one of the members of of Venice International Universities. And for students from the VIU members, there is no participation fee. So if you're interested in the topic of science communication, the call is open. There is support also for the cost of your travel and accommodation in Venice. So I just wanted to share this because since I'm talking here in this university, it seemed to be a good, to be good. Okay. Now I want to focus in this last part on a more recent investigation on the topic, as I said, of hate speech. I don't have much time. I want to leave some time for discussion, so I don't go into lots of details, and then if you want, we can have more in-depth discussion. So this study is part of the European project on online hate speech. The project is has some more wider goals, among which the development of detection algorithms for hate speech in different languages, the identification of triggers, and the production of recommendations and policies to the European communication regulators. What we did was to study the possible relationship between misinformation and toxic language. So the first real difficult definition is that of hate speech, because it can refer, so hate speech is usually the language that is considered illegal. We preferred to use and to analyze the whole spectrum of language that can be used in online debates, from normal language to the extreme and more violent language. We did this using YouTube data from on the topic of COVID-19 from December 2019 to June 2020, and to train our classification model, there was a consistent part of the project devoted to the manual annotation of more than 70,000 comments. These data sets are available because we released the data sets from the project, and in this case it's for Italian. We are also working on English, Slovenian, and Dutch. And the annotation schema that we used is the one that you find here. So the annotators, group of external annotators, were annotating the data for appropriate, inappropriate, offensive, or violent content. And we used this annotation data to train a standard neural model. And we applied the model to the whole data set. I just wanted to very quickly describe the results that we had. So we were comparing, first of all, the proportion of the 4 toxic language labels that we had for the different kind of sources. So questionable, what we can define as misinformation, and reliable sources on YouTube. And what we observe is that there is no particular differences in how the different language types are distributed across the 2 categories. And what we also observed was that there is comparable delays in terms of the time that elapses between the posting time of the video and that of the comment in hours. But on misinformation channels, the toxic comments arrive first and faster than the appropriate ones. And this is a first interesting difference that we observe among the 2 communities. The other very interesting result is that we do not find in our data what we defined as the pure haters, in the sense of users who only use a violent language, so violent comments. What we observe is that in the end we have users that we can define as common users, that in some cases use violent or inappropriate language. And so this is interesting also to understand what's happening in those particular cases. And so, for example, for the identification of triggers in the content or in the language of other users. The other important thing that we observe is the fact that also in this case we have the users divided towards the two categories, and what we observe is that there is a connection between the polarization of the user and the using toxic language. And very surprisingly, so the first unsurprising result is that the inappropriate comments are mainly used in the opponents community, and this is not surprising at all, and also in line with our previous results. But the interesting thing is that the users who on average have a higher proportion of non-appropriate comments are the users who generally get informed on reliable channels, not on misinformation channels. And the other thing that we observed was that the toxicity is intertwined with polarization, and that we have and we observe a positive correlation between toxicity and the length of discussion. The length of discussion, both in terms of time, but also in number of comments. And this is also something that we were observing for sentiment in general, and that we are confirming here. So the more we computed the toxicity of a discussion using these numerical values for each category of comment, so appropriate, inappropriate, offensive, and violent, and we computed then the average of the toxicity values for the comments. And so this is interesting because again it's telling us that when the discussion becomes longer, it's also more likely to have discussion that degenerates not only towards negative sentiments but also towards inappropriate or even violent discussions. The last thing that I want to mention is that we are also working now in this international research coalition that is a coalition focusing on the understanding of infodemics and the promotion of health information ecosystems. And the main focus on the coalition is, of course, vaccines and COVID-19, even if we are also working on other topics that are related to the infodemics and that are really relevant for the society, like, for example, climate change. I just wanted to mention this because this is a more recent and very active project where we are working now. Okay, I hope that I'm in time, and so thank you for listening, and I'm open to address your questions if you have.
Yes, we have plenty of time for questions. So we have already a few hands. So Pikashi, you can unmute yourself and make your questions.
Hi, thanks Fabiana for the great, wonderful talk. Congratulations on an ongoing, really active research project. It was really exciting to hear your talk, and I learned a lot of things. I'm obviously very interested in this area. I have worked, I did my PhD from Italy, so immediately I was in Milan. But anyways, that's my questions were, and I have worked in my PhD was in the area of NLP, sentiment analysis, and all those things, and I'm text analysis, and I'm very interested in that. So one of the things is that unfortunately misinformation, disinformation, fake news and all that, hate speech has become very pervasive in everyday aspects of our life. When you were considering your data sets to begin with, did you consider let's just say fabricated media or AI generated media or deep fakes? Or when you're considering your data set to start off your experimentation, do you just assume it as on their face value that this is true, and let's just see how the misinformation propagation or the hate speech toxicity works?
Okay, so the manipulated media is not something that I've focused so far, but I've discussed about this very recently with some colleagues. So it's on the pipeline because it's something that we want to address. In all these studies, I mean, the studies that I presented today, we didn't cover manipulated media or deep fake directly. What we did, and not all the studies use the same approach, but in some of the studies there is a categorization of the sources made. For example, in the very first studies, we relied on the help of debunkers, external debunkers, to identify the source, not the content. So the assumption behind the study is that if the source is categorized by an external and independent debunker as misinformation, we assume that all the content coming from that source is misinformation, but in the more general sense. Lately, what we have been used is instead the categorization of NewsGuard, that it's that's a bit more, I would say, a bit wider than the ones that some debunkers used, because NewsGuard used this categorization based on some criteria for credibility and transparency of the news sources. And the great thing about NewsGuard is that it's available for different countries. So this is facilitating the comparison across countries. And also the fact that NewsGuard assigns a score. So it's not a binary category, but you can get a score of the credibility of the source. So we are trying to refine the categorization in that way, but also I have to say that the identification of misinformation is one of the main problems that that of course we have, and especially on YouTube this was particularly challenging because it's not it's not so straightforward. And in that project we have also the collaboration of the Italian Authority for Communication. So they also have some data on this kind of information, but still misinformation on YouTube is very challenging. So we did our best to try to track the different sources, but it's still at the level of the source. And I'm discussing now, and we were thinking of moving also to some of the content and manipulated content, and they contextualize the content, because that's also a very nice category to address and to investigate more.
I have one more follow-up question, if you don't mind, Diego. Is there a way, instead of, can we do it, have you thought of doing it the other way around? Like if looking at a lot of content being generated from a given account and trying to predict whether that account is a bot or like some kind of misinformation or disinformation or fabricated media propaganda machine, so to speak, that, you know, this account just usually echoes all kinds of misinformation. So it might just be a bot, or it might just be an account which is only being used to create disinformation and then propagate it into the social network.
So, okay, we didn't focus on this kind of misinformation or bots, okay, behind misinformation, but also because I think that, okay, that's a part for sure. I don't think it's necessarily the biggest part of the problem. So especially if you think, for example, at the pandemic, because that's that's very unfortunate, but it's also a very interesting example for us, because when you are in a context, for example, of great uncertainty, and you have some contents that it's also very difficult sometimes to classify, to classify and put in one of the two categories, because maybe it's not that the content is false, but maybe the way in which it's presented can be misleading and so on. So it's very difficult to have that. And I think that's the big part of the problem in general of misinformation and the quality of information that we have and that we can address. So that's why I like the idea of focusing more on the, for example, general credibility of the source. So, okay, you can have some accounts there that are maybe bots or, I don't know, conspiracy theorist accounts, but I think that it's also important to, focus on those sources that are not necessarily for sources that you would classify as disinformation sources, but can spread lots of misleading or unreliable content, and can have an important role in that. So there are lots of shades in this, because
no,
of course it's a very complex issue, but
appreciate your candid responses. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
And I have a question, like somewhat related to this, because you're saying that it's easier. I don't know if the word is easier, but maybe it's better to focus on the credibility of the source instead of trying to judge every piece of information as true or false. And in another part of your presentation, you're talking about like how to communicate, and probably there are ways that if you communicate some way, that way can lead to more misinformation or not. So I was thinking about, like, at least in the past, when you just have like spams, let's start misinformation as spams. You have people trying to mimic mainstream media, so people trying to look legitimate. So, and when you get close, like to elections, for instance, there are several websites. There are random people trying to get money, but they just have a very fancy look, like trying to mimic the way mainstream media produce media, even though the content there is just rubbish or whatever. They are trying to do that. In the other side, when you look at the mainstream media, we see that every day they try to get some traction from social media, like whatever is happening on social media, they bring and start showing on mainstream media, like someone tweet this, someone tweet that, this is trending topics. So it's kind of, one is trying to mimic the other, but the other one, the mainstream, is trying to use somehow and get input from social media. So do you see if there is any transition or any trend in the traditional or reliable way of making news? They are shifting towards also to the misinformation or something like that? I don't know if I make myself clear.
No, okay. So what I can say is that for sure, there is another important issue that we have to consider, which is also the monetization of content, and how, for example, these sources can survive in an environment like that. And for example, this was one of the questions behind the work that we did with Corriere della Sera. And why? Because, for example, in that period, so migration was this hot topic in Italy, but it was not really a topic that needed to be communicated to and addressed, because it was not important. We had a decrease in the arrivals, of a very huge decrease, something like 87% decrease of the arrivals in Italy. But the topic was pushed from a part of the political parties in Italy, and the journalists there had, to decide, okay, what I'm doing here. If I do not talk about this, I can also see my kind of censorship of a part of the politicians. But on the other side, that particular topic on social media was the most engaging topic that they had. So the choice, okay, was also that if I do not communicate on this, I'm just losing and the audience, because people want to read this. This is the topic that is engaging most of my readers on this. So it was kind of, also challenging for the media side too, to stay in an environment like this. So that's why I think that on one side, for sure, even if you are a traditional media, you have to adapt to the new information system. From the other side, it's much more complicated than just, putting down some misinformation pages, because there are lots of other aspects that need to be addressed and to consider it if we want really to focus on the quality of the information that is produced. Because otherwise, it's just, some of these mechanisms that are driving the spreading of information that can also influence very strongly what content is showed and presented to the users, and also how the users are engaging with the content. So it's really something that we need to pay attention to, I guess.
Do we have any evidence, like in terms of methods and metrics, that the non-legitimate content is looking like more legitimate, or the other way around? Like, do mainstream media are becoming less legitimate somehow, or no? Or maybe just both?
I mean, this is I don't know. I don't know if we have data exactly for that. But for sure, I think that it's very difficult to have this, very binary distinction of what's legitimate and what's it's not. I guess that sometimes what you also have is shades between these two categories, and it can also change over time, and it can be, it can be that the source, I don't know. So it's very complicated. I don't know if we have already data on that, but it's interesting, an interesting point for sure that we can try to address.
Any other question?
I have a point to add to that about the monetization thing that you just picked up on, and the thing that Diego was just saying about one mainstream media being influenced by social media. Is that recently, or maybe it was last year, there was a whistleblower from Facebook who gave a testimony in the United States Senate, and she said that Facebook has been proactively pushing out negative content, even when it knew that it was toxic, for example, for young girls. It was still pushing out because it generated more money. So, I mean, these, tech giants, especially the ones who run social media, they know that misinformation, disinformation, or toxic information, they have those evidence that it is creating a lot of havoc in the society, so to speak, but they still keep on not doing anything about it because it creates a lot of money. And also, as a general rule of thumb, is that, negative people are more attracted to listening to or watching to negative breaking news rather than like a puppy being rescued, a positive breaking news. No one really, when you hear the term breaking news, it's usually something bad has happened. And that's why, so the media sensationalism and the monetization and the way these tech giants want to keep on propagating misinformation and hate speech, they all sort of influence each other in a very negative, all sorts of wrong cycles. And we live in this world of hate speech. Anyways, that was just a little bit of evidence that Diego was saying, if there's any.
Anyway, what you're saying is very important in the sense that it's, there is another point for sure that is very important now from our perspective as researchers working on this. And is the fact that, of course, the data, so the access to data in this regard is really crucial, because not having access to data in this moment, especially in some platforms more than in others, is shaping, first of all, the studies that we are doing, but also on the other side, we can say perhaps that it's protecting the privacy of the users, but on the other side, the only entity that has the data and so can understand what's happening there is the company, so the private company behind the platform. And I think that this can be an issue, and is an issue that we should discuss at a more and the level of society, because it's also for sure having more transparency from the platforms on how the platform works, the algorithms behind content production and selection works, and so on, can help not only the users but also the researchers to address the research questions more timely, and to understand better what's happening and the consequences, for example, of this kind of issues, because most of the times this is pretty difficult to study because we do not have the data to address some of these issues.
Well, I was curious when you mentioned about the way you communicate, they can be more prone or less prone to misinformation. So is that something that we could use, for instance, as you said, it's hard to label a video as misinformation or because it can be misleading, but imagine that you have a 1 hour video, at some point you tell a lie. So it's clear there is a lie over there. So can we use this type of methods to somehow throughout the entire video, you have some score that can give us, okay, now this is very likely to be true, and then depends on what's being said and how it's being said. Okay, now you have to raise your attention here, because here is more nebulous area that might be prone to misinformation. Like, try to at least help the viewer to see the moments that they need to be way more aware. Is that something that we can do?
I have to admit, I'm not really a big fan of labeling content, because I do believe that it's, I mean, I don't know if it's feasible. I don't know if it's effective, because in the end, it's the user who decides, to what content wants to see. So I'm really more for the let's try to work on to put in the system more quality content and to work on that, and to understand how we also, not only as users, not only as communicators on the side of the who communicate, but also on the side of the users, how we can improve that space that is also a social space where we live our digital lives. So that's where I'm more oriented towards that kind of solution, where I do not need to put a label, okay, to tell that the content is good or is bad, because I think that also can be very dangerous, because of course we are always, doing this kind of debates in democracies, and we do not always know how this kind of, labeling can work in other settings. And I do believe that instead we can much more work on how we can improve overall the quality of the system where we are getting our information, and where we are spending also lots of time. So both on the sides of the content, and I would say also on the other side of the awareness, of the users' awareness, how you use the platforms, how they work, also how we work as human beings when we select and interpret information. I do believe that it's a more combination of all these factors that can help us. But this is my personal perspective on this.
No, I totally agree. Like, I keep having this discussion with my family, for instance. Like, if you just think twice before sharing anything, would be so much better. Like, we have so much less misinformation going around, but we have this necessity just to share. I don't know. I still don't know why we do share so much. It's just to get prize or to be the center of the attention. I don't know. So maybe we need to fix this big problem just looking to ourselves, right? Okay, any other question? No?
Yes, if I may, like one
Sure.
last question. I don't know if we're running over time. Fabiana, it was an amazing talk. Thank you so much for this. And I really enjoyed also the discussion that came out of it. For the future, given your collaborations within the EU, what do you think that will be the main moves or future directions for researchers engaging in these kinds of projects from a European perspective, or like at least from an international perspective, let's say? Also, the UK, even though not being anymore in the European Union, it's still an affiliated member, so it's still like influenced a lot by the type of regulations and research directions that will take action in Europe. Can you comment a little bit about this, please?
Thank you, Massimo. I mean, this is a huge question. But I mean, I think that for sure the cooperation with platforms is something that is already on the table, but we need to. I mean, and it's really something that we have to deal with at the more at the broader European and international level, and so for sure I'm also the UK is involved in this, and I think that having this strict cooperation with the platforms and to work on this on the what I was saying before, on the transparency, on the not only on behind the algorithms, how the platform works, but also all the other problems that we were mentioning around advertisement and all these factors that can really affect how information is in the end consumed by users. And then I do not think that we can ignore this anymore, because these platforms have really become the main information sources for many users. And on some of these platforms, we spend lots of time. They have lots of information about the users, about us. And I think that it's really, really something that we need to discuss, to grant at least the possibility for the researchers from public institutions, or of course, we have to find a way to do this, but in a way that we can understand and study what's happening there, because it's really an important piece, I think, of the puzzle, even when we want to contrast a phenomena like, for example, misinformation, or more generally to understand how information spreads and how we can use this information also to help, for example, in a crisis like the pandemic that we are still living.
Perfect. I think these are very, very insightful points and very, very important they resonate a lot with all of us, I guess, in here, and probably also with our students who are a little bit curious about those kinds of challenges that they will be able to tackle in the future as data scientists or as computer scientists. Thank you so much, Fabiana. It was very inspiring. Thanks.
Thank you, Massimo.
Thank you, Fabiana. I think that's it.
Thank you, everyone, for being here and listening to my talk. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. See you guys around. Bye-bye.
Bye.